goal of this video is to 1. Show you where to find the things you'll need for setting up your projects, 2. To get you acquainted with the 3 solder stations and everything you'll use when soldering, and finally 3. To show you the expectations for cleaning up. When you're setting up your project to solder, you're going to need a special board that's located in this cabinet. You'll choose one that's about the size of the project that you're going to be setting it up on. When you get it, it may be covered with little bits of solder. You can hand pick these off, you can use a ruler, you can use a tool, or you can use a sponge. Hopefully the person before you who used this jig will have cleaned off the solder to make it a little easier for you. Anything that you get off of this, you can put in this bucket. And that's where they go at the end. Over here in this corner, we have aluminum strips, and we have thumbtacks, and these are longer aluminum strips. We call them layout blocks, and those are what you're going to be using, as well as the right angle tools or the set squares to square up your projects. This is the main solder table. There's room for 4 people. This is a second solder station. There are 3 spots at this table with similar things as the first table. And then this is the third soldering station. There are 3 spots with similar things. This is a soldering iron. There's a knob and an arrow pointed to numbers. 460 and 520 are what you'll see. That's in Celsius, but in Fahrenheit, the range is somewhere between 860 and 968 degrees. Very, very hot. The hottest part of the iron is the metal part from the barrel to the tip. And it should go without saying, you never ever rest it on anything that could melt, anything that's plastic or wood. Everything that the iron burns emits an odor, and it's going to be really obvious what got burnt and how it smells. All of this stuff that you're looking at right here is stuff that drips off the iron when the iron is just sitting there. To turn the irons on, you use a power strip, and you'll see that there are things that have red tags on them. Don't unplug them. Those are usually the fume extractors. You would turn the whole power strip on and unplug anything else plugged in, unless you have a friend who's going to be soldering over this way. Then you can plug this in for them, and their iron will heat up and be ready for them when they're ready to start soldering. That'd be nice. This is a bucket, and it has sponges and some water in it, and these are mostly used for wiping off the table, because the table's going to get really gross, and there's going to be bits of solder and flux all over it, and so wiping off the table at the end is going to be good. The sponge is also used for wiping off the tip. The tip also gets gross when you're soldering, and wiping it off every once in a while you're soldering is going to help. When the soldering iron is on, it's got a little blue light that blinks. That's how you know it's working. When it's flashing, you know it's up to temperature. And it's very, very hot. Just because you can melt something doesn't mean you should. Those hoses are $150 each. Just because it's plastic, please don't melt it. As well, these tools that you see at the center of the table are props. They're made out of tire rubber, and so they smell really bad when you melt them, so please do not melt them. We're going to need them, and we need them all to be unmelted. This bucket has a bunch of solder in it. This is reused solder, recycled solder that gets connected. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. That's always something that can be done when there's nobody soldering. But there's lots of little bits underneath that's still usable, mixed in with stuff that's not usable. But all the extra solder goes in there. This is a spool of solder, and it's 1 pound. We go through a lot of these, but this is what you'll be using, and you're going to be generating a lot of extra solder. This is flux. It's not hand lotion, so don't think that it is. That bottle travels. This is what the flux goes into. These are little jars with brushes in them. When it dries out, it gets really crusty and gross. We have to make sure not to overfill these jars. Anytime you see that it's empty or there's just a little bit in there, you can take one of these bottles, and take it to the other solder stations and just put 2 or 3 pumps in there, nothing more. Anything extra starts to turn really gummy and like sugar syrup, and it's kind of disgusting. So that's all you need. We use this kind of flux because it's friendly on all of our fume extractors. The other flux used to eat away at the plastic. This is a fume extractor. It's like a very, very fancy, expensive shop vac. It has a long hose that extends from the top of the machine, under the table, and it winds up, goes up over, and there's a nozzle that hovers over where you will be working when you're soldering. We always use flux for soldering our projects. It helps the solder to melt, but the downside is that it produces lots of smoke and it releases lots of particles into the air. What the fume extractor does is it pulls all the smoke away from your nose and prevents you from inhaling them, which can trigger asthma attacks and breathing reactions. So we're helping to keep everyone healthy by using them, so we always keep it very close to our work. To turn them on, there's an on-off button. So the little switch here, turn it to on, you see a green light and a little flashing yellow light. You'll also hear it. That's how you know that it's working. And if you put your hand there, you'll notice it's a vacuum. We don't send unnecessary stuff up this vacuum though. It's a bad idea, because if you send things like little bits of paper or foil or tiny bits of glass up this fume extractor, it winds up down here. And when it's down here, it gets trapped in a filter. And then the filter doesn't do its job anymore. It makes the motor work harder. And we don't want that, so don't send the extra stuff up. This is a little word about solder. So solder's pretty expensive. These rolls come in 1-pound spools, and they're about $13.75 or so. And we use segments of solder at a time. We melt off a little bit at a time. And we're gonna have lots of little solder bits left over like this. The solder gets really, really hot when we're holding it. And so there comes a time when the solder gets too hot for us to hold, so we drop them. This is what's left over, lots of these little bits. So collectively, all of these bits that we can no longer hold get put into this solder scrap bucket. And we have a lot of solder scrap. And so we never throw it away because it's toxic and it winds up in our environment if we throw it away. And we don't want that. So we sweep it into our hands via the sponge, and then we put it into the bucket. We don't ever sweep it onto the floor. That's bad. When we try and bring this scrap to a metal recycling place, we don't get $13.75 a pound for it, like what we paid. We only get about 75 cents. That's a huge loss. So what we try and do is we reuse it, we recycle it by connecting these little bits together to make them reusable. So when we melt off segments of solder, we use the side of the tip like this. So we put it off to the side and we hold it there and it melts through. That's how we can tell the soldering iron is hot. Don't slice the solder too close to the spool, because if you do, you're going to melt a big blob of solder onto the roll like that. We can't unspool any more solder. So here's a usable piece of solder, and here's how we make those little chains of solder, all of the usable solder to connect. We melt off the end, and then we place that blob of melted solder to connect it to another bit, and we have reusable solder. Find that you end up having lots of solder at the end of your iron. Please resist the urge to hit it against the table. The inside of the iron has a little porcelain heating element. Porcelain's very, very fragile ceramics. If we hit it, it will break. Anytime you need to set the iron down, you can set it against the table or on or in the holder. To clean up your area, you make sure that you turn the power strip off, or you can just unplug your iron and you turn off your fume extractor. So you go over to the side of the table and flip the switch off. You'll also need to remove all your bits of solder off the table. Take all the flux off as well. So you're gonna put your solder back in the bucket and you're gonna wipe the table of all of the extra flux. And you can sweep all of this solder that might be on the table, sweep it into your hand, and then all of that extra solder will go into the bucket. If you leave any flux remaining on the table, the next person can get a rash from it. So it's good to wipe off the table like that. And then put the sponge back in the bucket. As long as all your tools are put away, everything is shut off, and your table's been wiped off, you're all good. Please allow 5 to 7 minutes before the end of class to do this, because you will also need time to wash off and put away your project.